Hello and welcome to the ECM Records podcast. I'm Marco Mallardi and I'm happy to host this new episode, taking you behind the scenes of the latest recordings by ECM. In this new episode, I'm joined by Rolf Lislevand, who discusses his latest album, Libro Primo, produced by Manfred Eicher. Playing his turbo and arch lute, in this album he interprets Baroque works, and in this episode he discusses his innovative way of interpreting Baroque music, blending historical awareness with a more dynamic and inventive approach. Moreover, he offers an in-depth discussion of the compositions and the concept behind the album. Thank you, Rolf, for being here at the ECM podcast. My first question is about the title of your new album. Your new album is called Libro Primo, since many of the pieces come from the very first publications of these Baroque composers that you chose. What was behind the decision to focus on their first books, which is the translation of Libro Primo? What idea brought you to go deep into this specific repertoire?
Well, partly it kind of happened to be like that the pieces and the works I found the most interesting were actually taken from the first book. I didn't really look for it in that first objective, but it happened to come like that. And it struck me then in a second moment that there is something special with these kind of first publications, that the composers have a kind of very ambitious and fresh, also kind of young view of their works in these first publications. I mean, it's like there was a funny Italian rock group, which is, I think, called Elio Tante Storie Tese, and they made a song which was called "The second album is always the most complicated to make."
Yes.
And I think that indicates somehow that problematic. There is something very, as I said, very inspired about the first works you do. And when it happened, this kind of coincidence that the works I found independently of that interesting, they happened to be basically from the first book of the composers.
Okay, so you found these tracks, studied them, and then you actually realized that they were part of these first books of these composers, right?
Yeah. And then at a certain point, we will probably discuss a little bit also the importance of actually written music in this period, because that's another subject which is quite different from what we are used to from the so-called kind of mainstream approach to classical music and the written music in itself. But first book are the basic inspiration, and I felt this inspiration from the composers very close to my own enthusiasm and inspiration of getting known to these works by the scores themselves. And of course, as we always do with this early music type of approach, we read from the original scores, which are not normal staff notation. It's all about what we call in tablature, which is a specific lute and guitar way of writing music, which gives, in a certain way, a very high level of preciseness in the writing, but also kind of a, so to speak, certain space of liberty in the way you interpret the music, because there is quite some information missing in these tablatures, and these missing information, you may choose to approach it as a problem, as a frustration, something, or you may choose to approach it as an inspiration and a kind of a space of liberty and freedom and creativity, which is kind of more my approach to these things.
And about the tablature, do you think that this kind of music writing, which is very specific of the Baroque music, do you think that this kind of music writing has in some way shaped the way performance approaches, even today, this kind of music?
Now, the interesting thing is that the tablature, it creates a very immediate and direct relation between yourself as a musician and player and the instrument itself. Because the information you're kind of used to have in later way of writing music, in later notation, it gives more precise, absolute, abstract information about interpretation, but it doesn't relate as strong to the instrument. So what is good with later type of normal what we call pentagram notation or staff notation, is that you can play any piece with any instrument if you like to. But the very, very fascinating and like magical things with the lute notation, which we call, as I said, the tablature, is that you actually have to listen to what's coming out of the instrument before you understand the music. So you put down the fingers and you do what the tablature tells you, but you can't actually really know what musically is happening in terms of sound and timbre and colors and anything actually before you actually play it on the instrument. And that makes a very, very, very intimate and immediate relation between the sound of the instrument and your way of perceiving the music, basically.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And regarding the instrument itself in the specific, how did you approach the tunings? I mean, did you use standard tunings or not? Because, for example, you transcribed more than one track from arch lute to theorbo, and this implies a switch of tunings. Moreover, we know that theorbos and arch lutes have several kind of possible tunings. So how did you approach this kind of element?
Well, once more, first of all, the most fascinating thing with the tablature writing and notation is that it doesn't tell anything about the tuning. That has to be known from the beginning, or you have to know it from other, what we call secondary sources. So these secondary sources, which are like reading some explanations, some prefaces, some other books talking about the instrument and its tuning, they are not very accessible always, and they're sometimes also very contradictory. They don't really tell in a very clear way how the tuning is supposed to be. So it sounds maybe like secondary for someone not playing a lute instrument, but actually the tuning of the instrument changes everything. So if you would play in a certain tuning, you would play one music, and if you would play in another tuning, you would play a completely different music. And we know this from even any type of contemporary type of plucked string instrument traditions, like, guitar, modern players of modern guitar, they will retune the instrument all the time. And sometimes as I would say, a little bit maybe provocative sometimes, I sometimes used to think that when a guitar player doesn't have any more musical ideas, he would just change the tuning and play the same fingerings, and then some new music would come out of that. And I mean, it's not as bad as that, but there is some very kind of inspiring thing with the way that the instruments work according to the tuning. So what I did with the recording was that I felt that the traditional tuning we used the last 30, 40 years in lute playing for like the arch lute, it didn't really reply very well to what I imagine in that music. I thought there was something, to be very specific, there was something kind of typical Baroque or 17th century element which was missing in the tuning of the arch lute. And that's why I played around with the tuning, and I played the music with different tunings. I changed the strings and changed kind of things all the time in the process of recording. And I came to the point that there is a way of tuning the instrument which makes it really what I would call specifically Baroque. And then we come to the point to say what is specifically Baroque, because this is what's happening in the beginning of the entrance of the 17th century in Italy, especially, that the old, what they call the old music, was a very kind of music built on vocal polyphony. So there was like very kind of straight four voices lines in music that the instruments would play in the same way as you would sing it. And then suddenly in the 17th century, they changed up completely the whole concept of what they wanted music to be at that period. And the new concept was that they wanted music to be like fascinating sound surfaces. They wanted to be like timbres and colors, and actually not especially singing melodies or something, but just fascinating soundscapes. And this brings us also to why kind of we came to ECM with these things, because I think this is one of the, if you can describe in a few words the incredible creation of the label ECM has to do with the sensibility of soundscapes and colors and surfaces and landscapes and everything, these elements in music, more than necessarily like complex structures in music and things. And the whole thing with the tuning, the thing with the tuning is that you can find a tuning which allows this on these instruments, and obviously these tunings were actually legitimate and used in the 17th century. So that was one of the kind of, I won't say revolutionary, but kind of a little, so to speak, inventive or personal approach to use that in this recording.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that this kind of repertoire was quite revolutionary for its time, we can say. In fact, it belongs to what is known as the Seconda Practica, which literally means the second or new practice, which was a musical approach developed in Florence by a group of humanists, artists, scientists, known as the Camerata de' Bardi. The point is that this new kind of style and approach to music and composition totally showed a new way of conceiving musical aesthetic. Can you please explain this point and specify how this new musical conception is reflected in the composition that you chose?
Yeah, well, I think there are like two important things to say about that. One is kind of a historical observation, which is that it's quite unique, I think, in music's history, that people come together, and people, as you just mentioned, were humanistic, very educated people in Florence, not necessarily musicians, but artists, scientists. And they would come together and say that we have to rewrite or rethink and redo music. This is a thing which normally doesn't happen. I mean, music evolves. It has all type of different influences and take all type of different directions, like water flows in the earth. And the fact that you sit down and say that you're going to change things from one day to the other one, it's an incredibly strong and radical process. And the interesting thing is that it actually worked out in a way. I mean, you would say that would never work out, but it did work out. And that's in itself, I think it's rather unique in the whole music's history in Western music, the last 500 years, more or less. The other thing is what actually was the real difference between the musical styles, because as I said before, there was this like music based on very somehow quite academical, especially vocal music, which was what we call polyphony. And polyphony was an incredibly architecture of a musical building. In a way, it is just, when you see some of the composers of the 16th century, it's far above any other composers later in terms of technical skills and intelligence in music. So it was just coming to a point which was absolutely superior and which couldn't be somehow developed further. It was just came to its summit that was as good as it could ever be in that way of thinking music. But somehow people seem to had a new need or a new idea about what music should give them and tell them, because this Renaissance way of thinking of music, it had one quite funny or strange, or what should I say, aspect which we, I think, have some problems to understand today, which was that the emotional part of the music was not directly connected to the listening experience of the music. The emotional part was supposed to be like a type of consequence of understanding rationally the music. So the Renaissance man seems to have, first of all, understood these very complex structures. And then the emotion comes out from the understanding, which is philosophically quite a curious thing for us today. This is not how we think even man is working today, that you first have to understand something to feel something. That's a way of thinking we are very, very far from in our modern society, I think. And I think that's what was the problem for entering into the 17th century, that they wouldn't actually do that anymore. They would like the music to express really the emotion in the first place immediately. So they kind of cut away all this complicated, like polyphonic and contrapuntal stuff. And they just wanted sound to be the thing which gave you an emotion in a way. And this is what happens, especially with a plucked instrument. That's why this is so interesting, because the lute instruments, they are some kind of irrational instrument. They're not like a piano where you can see all the voices in kids, and they're not like in a violin with all the nice melodies going back and forth. And the plucked instrument is like a mixture of everything. But what they have in special is that you can sometimes just struck some strings, so a lute or a harp or any type of plucked instrument with strings, and it's just magical in a way. It sounds absolutely charming and fantastic. It doesn't disturb you. It's aesthetic. It's beautiful. And that's all we need in a way. And this was kind of what came into that whole scene in the first half of the 17th century, that they got so fascinated about these sounds just of the instrument. So they could sit around and play stupid chords and just beautiful sounds, and they would all be happy about that. This is very hard to understand for us today, because we all, I mean, you're Italian, so I guess at the age of 12, you were sitting in a piazza someplace in Italy and playing a little guitar. People would strum around, and this is all fine. This is so natural today. But in this period, that never happened still. So the sound of just surface of sound, the sound of the strings, the sound of the harmony, that was so fascinating for people. And this is what happens with all this music we found in the first half of the 17th century, which is the music I recorded on this recording, because I somehow also feel that actually some of the sounds, the harmonic language, the way the instrument replies to the different type of using the instrument, it's actually still very, very modern. And I mean, I would claim that it's actually modern even for people today in a way. If you to listen to some of my very respected colleagues like Ralph Towner, a colleague on ECM, and someone who are using a lifetime to explore beautiful soundscapes on the instrument. I think this is very close to that in a way, and it's a historical phenomenon. It happened like that.
One of the long-standing issues for Baroque performers is the interpretative approach to take. Interpreters of this repertoire tend to follow two principal approaches: the philological, historical informed approach, and a more dynamic approach, where the interpreter in some way contributes directly in shaping the composition itself. Can you please explain which is your idea regarding this point, and so how you approach the repertoire you played in the album?
Well, for me, I don't think these two approaches are contradictory. They could actually live together. Of course, sometimes you feel that we come back to the fact sometimes that people need to be assured and to be confirmed in their convictions. So it's very practical to say that this is good because it was like that. And sometimes I feel that the so-called authentical or historical approach, it's a little bit a child of this need of feeling that you have to be, sure that this was like this. We may not like it today, and you don't like it, I don't like it, but I play it just because it was like that, and I tell you then that's the only reason why I do it. I don't like that approach so much. I think the historical approach is interesting insofar that it gives us inspiration, actually. And I also think that the historical approach is an important correction, not to go too fast and too direct to easy solutions in music. I think sometimes today what, in my opinion, may happen with some Baroque musicians is that we can kind of go back to be easily directed by very simple solutions. Which may turn out to be a little bit banal or a little bit even cliche or a little bit even bad taste about things. And I think the historical informed part should be the correction to this. The historical informed should be to tell you that, give it one more thought what you're doing. Is it kind of possible that this style could have these elements that you want to bring into it as a creative contemporary musician today? Is it sure that these elements were appropriate? And if they were not appropriate, there may have been a reason for that. And this reason altogether, this process is maybe, it's a dangerous word to use, but you can talk about what is kind of basically about good taste in music. And then you have these fine kind of nuances, what we sometimes in France, they would say, le bon mauvais goût, the good bad taste, which is kind of a very delicate, balance on these different elements. But as I said, for me, the most important thing is to use the historical informed thing as a very, very important reference and correction. But as the historical information is not complete, it very, unfortunately, I would say, it very soon ends up to be very lacking information. Then I would say I can't stop myself as a creative musician just because there is some lacking information on this point. And if there is no information which tells me that I cannot do what I want to do, then I probably would do it. But of course, if there is some historical information saying that this was not done, then I would not do it. So this is what I call the kind of historical correction to my creativity as a modern musician dealing with this Baroque music.
And that's also the reason why you've chosen to add some improvisations to your interpretations inside the recording, right?
Sure, because improvisation is the most critical element when we talk about historical performance. Because we all know that improvisation is spontaneous composition. And we also all know that improvisation, the point of improvisation, or one point of improvisation, is to develop the life or work. So it kind of goes further into different ways, the music itself. The problem with all that is that, of course, if you recreate improvisation the same way as people did improvise in the Baroque area, then you actually don't improvise. You just do a stylistic exercise in a way. And we all know that Baroque musicians were great improvisers. And they were great composers, and basically all the instrumentalists, they were themselves writing the music for their instruments, they were performing their own music for the instrument, and they were improvising on the instruments. So it's obvious that they were absolutely, completely the masters of their own style, in a way, musically. Now the problem is that if you want to improvise, and we know that there has been like 300 years between the last time a Baroque piece was performed and today that we re-perform this Baroque piece. What do? I mean, I, as a modern musician, I have a lot of things in my head, a lot of music in my head that I've heard, which belongs to my own life's history, which are about, 60 years of modern history and modern music. And if I said that I have to try to make some kind of a selection of what I use of that becomes extremely not spontaneous, and it's like against any spirit of improvisation. So what I say is that somehow my way of thinking of it is that I would like to play a Baroque piece the day, so to speak, to position myself to play this piece, the day after the last time this piece was played in the Baroque period. This performance never happened because it was the day after the last one. And I'll catch up on that today. And I do actually have to consider what my own musical heritage has been since that. So that is for me improvisation, is to say that I must bring things into that music which I have experienced, which is spontaneously associating to what I hear in the Baroque music. And the important part is that it is not about a process of like some type of crossover music or something, or to kind of mixed style or something. I don't care about that. I actually disregard that very much. But when I hear some of the pieces I read in the old books, in the old tablatures, they make me think about a lot of other music I know. And when they do that, I think there is some kind of organic and natural process which is going on creatively that I can use in a way, and which is legitimate to use. I'm in the right to use that as a creative musician. So that is my approach to improvisation, I think, rather than just trying to combine elements of Baroque music, which were not combined exactly in that way in the period. That would be what I call an exercise of style, while improvisation is bringing the whole kind of musical experience into a piece which becomes a new piece, and which I hope would have actuality, and which I hope would kind of touch people and move people who are listening to that music today.
Even because in the Baroque music, especially in this kind of repertoire, compositions were limited to just one page. So if you limited yourself as an interpreter to just what was written on the page, then the whole performance lasted just 1 minute. So in some way you were, and you are now, compelled to go on and to use that kind of one-page composition as a kind of a script where you have to improvise and to compose something else, to evolve the script that was once written down.
That's exactly the point. The point you put it. The important point I catch up with what you just said is that not only you can do it, but you have to do it. Because the way the pieces are written down is like a kind of an example or a testimony of the existence of a piece. It's not telling how the piece was performed or how you should perform it again. That is another matter. So it's like almost an obligation to kind of create a new form which corresponds to people's way of understanding or listening, what we call the dramaturgy of music, how you feel the narrative, the telling way of the kind of whole timeline in a story in the music.
Regarding this point, Passacaglia al modo mio is entirely composed by you. In the booklet, for example, you mentioned that in this composition there are reminiscences of Baroque music. You name, for example, Bach and the composer Barbara Strozzi, as well as more contemporary references as Keith Jarrett, for example. So I wanted to ask you, in what way are these composers present in the piece? I mean, do you explicitly quote any musical ideas from their works? If so, which ones? Or is their influence more nuanced, more indirect, more abstract?
Well, it's not indirect in the sense that some of the themes are actual existing themes of these composers. But the fact that they are in the piece is completely an evolution, a process which was out of control in a way. And this piece is probably some kind of small little testament from myself, which regards these, what we talked about earlier today, that the fact of until which point do you accept your own musical heritage and what you have in your mind as a modern musician when you're supposed to play an old instrument, a lute instrument from the 17th century. So the Passacaglia al modo mio is probably some kind of coming to having me saying my last word about what this is about, the relation to being an improvising modern musician and bringing this into type of Baroque musical style. What should be said is that there is a little kind of justification about this in a more also historical informed type of view, which has to do with the fact that the Passacaglia in this period was the only form which allowed the musicians to bring in the most radical and the most unconventional ideas of their musical mind in the Baroque period, in the 17th century. As you may think about, most of the pieces of Baroque music are actually very strictly, formally defined dance pieces, like Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, and all these things. And these type of pieces, they don't allow you to go very far in terms of creativity or personal invention, or try to kind of bring things further in a formal and even a harmonical and melodical way. The other only piece which is some kind of freer form in the Baroque period are the preludes and the toccatas. But these pieces don't have any rhythmical aspects. They are only completely rhythmical, free narrative pieces. So at the period, the Passacaglia was form which was the playground and the big moment of liberty for all the composers to bring in their own individuality, which was quite unusual in the Baroque period, because you didn't expect the musician to be individual artist the way that musicians were in the 19th and 20th century. So this form of Passacaglia, which is basically an extremely simple four-note kind of ground, we call it in the Baroque music. There are four notes repeating themselves. It's a descending scale. Upon these very simple descending scales, some of the Baroque composers, they composed incredibly original and very daring and very kind of personal ideas developed that they couldn't develop in any other form. So I would catch up these things using the Passacaglia to eventually say that now I take my clothes off in a way, and I show you what is my musical memory, all the things I have in my mind when I hear these four notes that can associate to a lot of other music I've heard in my own life. And kind of in a little shameless way, I thought I'll just like to do that and say that this is the ultimate kind of consequence of this attitude and this positioning, how I position myself to the historical performance thing and to the early music repertoire. So I bring in there are themes of Bach, there are themes of Strozzi, as you say. There are even the theme of Beethoven at the end. There is a theme of Enrico Morricone. There is some Kitcheret. There's a lot of things. All the music I really love and like, and it just comes very spontaneously to do that. And I kind of put it together and said that, well, this is the very ultimate reply to that attitude of how you are a kind of creative and improvising music with early instruments and partly with an early music culture of today.
And so these contemporary references came spontaneously during the improvisational process or the compositional process. How did it work?
Well, I never really think of myself composing music because I don't really write it down really. That is also a part of how I position myself. I don't kind of really like to think that I'm composing, partly because I can't compose and partly because I think this is not my role in that sense. My role is that when I play something, I sit down and play, things are kind of coming a little bit just into my ears as associations. Very often also with other pieces in the recording, not only the Passacaglia, when I play some of the things I read in the original scores from the composers, I immediately kind of hear other things which I feel connect to that. And these other things I hear, they are not necessarily kind of strictly Baroque themes or don't have so much to do with Baroque music, but it's just music which I feel connects to that in a kind of organic way. And for me, that makes something which is a kind of in between being composing things and in between that and just performing what is written. So that is a kind of my solution to be a kind of creative interpreter, but not really a composer in that sense of the words. And actually, the Passacaglia has never been really written down. There are some kind of sketching down things just to remember some ideas and so. But the piece, it evolves while playing it in concerts, and it becomes the piece. It becomes also with feeling how like public react to the things I play and so.